Okay. So black tea comes predominantly from former European colonies, from East Africa to Southeast Asia. In these places, tea is plucked, pruned, fermented, dried, rolled, sorted, and packaged by hand on plantations. From plantations, tea is shipped to auction centers in former colonial port cities like Kolkata, Colombo, and Mombasa, where brokers taste and evaluate it before selling it in public auctions. Kolkata is the heart of the Indian tea industry. Brokers here evaluate over half of the tea produced in North India. Millions of kilograms pass through the hands, under the noses, and across the tongues of these brokers. Brokerage is a specialized job. Membership in social clubs, facility with English, European dress, and athletic prowess are all seen as signs of one's qualification. On a Tuesday morning in 2009, I joined a broker on the top floor of Nilhat House in India's oldest auction center. Mr. Paul, a thin, tall, avuncular man, was lecturing apprentice brokers about how to properly evaluate tea in order to give it a valuation price for the weekly auctions that his firm oversaw. A group of assistants quietly brewed tea samples, carefully timing the steeping of leaves with British-made white enamel clocks. Mr. Paul waxed about tea's remarkable variability. It's an agri product, he stressed, so this is a natural variability. A broker's apprentice is measured by his, and yes, it is almost always his, ability to corral tea's varied tastes, smells, looks, and textures into a few words drawn from a fixed glossary. For example, here's how another broker, Mr. Datta, evaluated an invoice of tea. He slurped one tea, and then the next. Typiclonals have fair make. More emphasis on sorting would be a benefit. He smelled the pile of steep leaves, and then slurped the liquor. Mixed. Fannings are acceptable. Colonial has brightness and character, but quality is not there. He slurped another cup. A little short, but also not entirely clean. Bloom is lacking. Mr. Datta poured the dry leaf of the next invoice onto a large piece of cardstock. He shook it back and forth, giving it a few flicks with the back of his fingertips, before bending the cardstock in his hand and funneling the tea back inside the bag. And there's the cardstock. So printed on the top of each of these pieces of cardstock that Mr. Datta and his colleagues used are the words, "It pays to make good tea." This phrase is instructive. Brokers do not see themselves as merely separating the good from the average or the subpar. They explicitly understand their work as one of active making, of bringing good teas into being. For them, qualification pays. It is remunerative to them, to sellers and to buyers, because it is part of the production process. In this way, tea tasting exemplifies what Deborah Heath and Anne Manili call the historical dialectic between technique, or knowledge as craft or as embodied craft or skill, and episteme, knowledge as systematic classification. In many ways, brokers are aesthetic experts, not unlike storytellers or visual artists. On the technique side of the dialectic, they must hone an ability to craft subjective experiences of taste into words and numbers. On the epistemic side, brokers are guardians of a system of classification and valuation. They are part of a commodity infrastructure that spans from remote tea plantations to antique coal-fired processing factories to the bronze scales, stained ceramic cups, and white aprons of the tasting room at Nilhat House. As much as numerical price, it's words like make, character, and brightness that indicate a tea's quality. A list of some 150 terms is published by the Calcutta Tea Traders Association and rendered on kind of glossy posters that adorn the brokerage firm walls. Today I'll tell the story of these tea words to argue for a view of quality as an experimental relationship between bodies, materials, and markets. A relationship that is grounded in histories of the plantation and histories of colonial science. So in Keywords, Raymond Williams identified a certain kind of concept one for which the problem of its meanings seemed inextricably bound up with the problems it was being used to discuss. Quality is one such concept. Quality gained prominence in the tea industry, in the Indian tea industry, and in tea industry discourses between the 1930s and the 1950s, just as the authority of colonial actors was starting to come under question. This was an experimental moment. A fixed lexicon for describing quality was first advocated not by brokers, but by scientists employed with the Indian Tea Association, or what I'll refer to as the ITA. And the Indian Tea Association was a kind of a guild, very much a guild of British-owned tea plantation companies. And so this is where the lexicon was, codified lexicon was coming from. So drawing on material from the archives of the ITA, I'll first talk about how at the tail end of British colonial rule in India, the governance of the tea industry came to revolve around the problem and the definition of quality. The glossary served to stabilize not just the quality of tea or even the authority of British brokers, but also it served to stabilize the colonial institution of the tea plantation. And I'll pair this historical material with ethnographic narratives of tea brokerage. My ethnographic work revealed how, as subjective experiences are shared through words, norms of gendered and racial inequality that were first established on the colonial plantation are re-articulated. Tea tasting continues to be the subject of what Michel Calon terms real-life experiments. Experiments whose form captures that dialectic between technique and episteme, between the norms of colonial science and the norms of colonial aesthetics. With this tension in mind, I suggest that quality is not an end to itself, a final destination for imperial or economic or post-imperial projects. Instead, quality continues to reanimate those projects. So before I kind of continue with the story of Teawords, I want to provide a little bit more context to where this kind of sits and what I'm working on. And so perhaps, pertinent to the discussion of food at hand, food scholars and food studies scholars have been documenting a so-called quality turn for the past kind of 20 years. Following the growth of a growing market for artisanal, luxury, and kind of otherwise fancy bourgeois products, like Darjeeling tea, which is the subject of my first book. And this quality turn, as it's articulated in academic discourse, this quality turn makes it appear that quality is something that only rests in such fancy luxury products. And I want to kind of trouble that a little bit. So I first came to Nilhat House in pursuit of such, understanding such quality products. I came to Nilhat House while I was doing work for my first book on fair trade certified tea production in Darjeeling. But I quickly learned for brokers that labels like fair trade or even organic didn't really matter at all. But this didn't mean that quality didn't matter. So the starting point for my new book, sorry, this is slightly shameless, but the new book, Tasting Qualities, which is kind of what I'll talk around a little bit today. So the material focus of what I'm talking about today and in the book is mass market black tea. So like cheap tea that is in your tea bag. And the core argument of the larger book project is that what counts as quality tea is not just a matter of consumer preference. Or even environmental or labor conditions at the point of production, at the point of the field. But what goes on at kitchen tables and on plantations is absolutely important to the story of quality. What I kind of want to think about in the larger book is to pay attention to the spaces in between. Those of brokerage, but also blending, auctioning, and food chemistry. So it's kind of shifting focus to these kind of interstices of commodity production, right? The spaces between production and consumption. So even the cheapest, most ordinary looking tea arrives in its cup in a reliable form thanks to a set of linguistic, technological, and aesthetic techniques, not just for judging quality, as if quality was kind of always out there just waiting to be perceived, but for producing quality. Mass market black teas are blends of many different tastes, origins, and grades of tea. A bag of Tetley or PG Tips, for example, is often a blend of 20 to 30 different kinds of tea, which traders refer to as invoices. Some invoices may have been recently harvested, while others may have sat in a warehouse for months. Some invoices are chosen for their flavor, others for their appearance, and others for their cost. Reach for another box of the same brand of tea a week or even a month later, and it will be composed of a completely different set of 30-something teas, and a totally different combination of regions, grades, ages, and flavors. The teas inside will be different, but the taste will be familiar. In fact, your preferred tea bag tastes the same because the teas inside are totally different. Teas seem to be infinitely reproducible, despite the fact that what tea is highly variable. So in the larger book project, I asked what quality is and where quality is, geographically and historically. But I also asked what quality does. What claims about it are made, by whom, and importantly, with what consequences. I do this through ethnography in several sites, right, in that space between production and consumption, that include fields and factories, but also that pay attention to blending operations and auctions. But today I want to focus on two of these kind of interstitial spaces in particular, and that's the laboratory and the tasting room, which you've already kind of gotten a glimpse of. So these are both key, if also somewhat understudied sites, and really kind of experimental nodes in food systems. Like a laboratory experiment, tea tasting entails an ordered set of operations, from brewing precise amounts and quantities of tea to measuring the flavor, appearance, and texture of steeped liquor against a known set of standards. So in an interview with me, a Nilhat House broker I'll call Mr. Chettle described learning to be a broker in this way. Quoted, "You train, and one day you realize you're training yourself through your own processes of experimentation." He's referring to a broker's need to creatively combine his sensory faculties, his familiarity with the terms in the glossary of Teawords, and his knowledge about the dynamics of the market. For tea brokers, experimentation with words is at the same time experimentation with things and with bodies. The ability of a broker's body to sense tea is both an outgrowth of plantation production and a means of reproducing it. As Mr. Chettle explained, if I said stewy to you, what would you think? Right? It has the characteristics of a stew, right? Thick, cloudy. But no, that's not what it means at all. The meaning is much more exact. It refers to the exhaust temperature. It means that a tea was fermented at too high a temperature, that it over-fermented. It therefore has become soft. So in his work on the terms it used to describe wine, Michael Silverstein notes that such words act as a kind of connective tissue, linking nodes in the trajectory from production to consumption. Tea words such as stewy and soft connect taste, smell, and appearance to events in the field and in the factory. And tea words, importantly, work in combinations. So stewy and soft. Mr. Chettle's hypothetical stewy tea was also soft. It lacked briskness. A soft tea lacked briskness, meaning a liquor that is alive, like fresh spring water. It also lacked brightness. A liquor and leaf whose colorful pop would be visible even when mixed with milk. Seemingly straightforward words like cheesy, minty, and fruity do not reference the sensations of cheese, mint, or fruit. That would be too easy. Right? These words signal instead different taints in the teas imparted during storage and in transport. Biscuity tea is a pleasant characteristic, And shoddy teas are not shoddy at all, but instead well-made. Spongy teas are actually flat and flaky, and an earthy taste, while maybe desirable in some wines, indicates that a tea was stored in damp conditions, while winey liquors are over-fermented, albeit in sterile conditions. So Mr. Chetto continued on this line, quoting, "The language of tea is an intra-trade language. Tea is unlike wine, in whose language is applied towards the consumer. Wine terms," he said, "are evocative. They're finely tuned and pleasing. They generate emotion. Tea's terminology is distinct in that it is only an expert language. Consumers who drink tea will likely never be aware that tea words exist. Tea words are instead oriented towards tea production. They're oriented back to the plantation." So the origin of tea words lied as much in colonial agronomic science as in the colonial economy of prestige. So I want to now kind of step back from the contemporary brokerage house and those tasting rooms to discuss this historical meeting between science and prestige. So in 1911, the Indian Tea Association, right, the ITA, that guild of British-owned plantation companies and their marketing arms, established what was called the Toklai Experimental Station in Jorhat, Assam. Early Toklai experiments were kind of in areas such as pest management, and they were oriented towards the maximization of quantity, right? The maximization of the quantity of tea that a given plantation could produce, right? This was what it was set up for. It's set up for kind of mitigating against blights, mitigating against pest infestations, and maximizing the amount of tea these new plantations could produce, right? That exploded in the late 1800s. But by 1932, a global economic depression was underway, and consumer buying power started to ebb. Facing shrinking demand, tea plantations across the British Empire kind of collectively agreed to curb production and focus on what they termed the making of quality tea. So it was in this context of an industry-wide turn to quality that a chemist and meteorologist at Toklai named C.R. Harler first proposed a standardized glossary. Harler had observed brokerage practices in both Kolkata and in London, and he became frustrated that no one in the industry used a common language to describe the characteristics of tea. He elaborated this critique in a 1932 article in which he complained not only that brokerage language was unstandardized, but also that there are a good number of terms used by individual tasters which convey little or nothing to the average planter. Thus, in one case, a tea infusion was described as tasting like a bandsman's tunic. Delicious. Such an expression connotes unpleasantness and may denote sweatiness, but gives no definite guidance to the planter who wants to trace a shortcoming in his tea to some incorrect factory procedure. Phrases like bandsman's tunic, while long on poetics and certainly descriptive, were metaphorical. Their material reference lay outside of the chain of sites along which tea traveled. Harler argued that it was possible to link tea words to production processes. He proposed not just to narrow the number of descriptive words and terms to be used, but to identify which chemical constituents of tea were responsible, either wholly or in part, for such qualities such as sweatiness, or also rawness, briskness, pungency, strength, color, and thickness. Right? What were the chemical correlates to those words, to those sensations? In 1934, the ITA submitted Harler's glossary to the Tea Brokers Association for comment. The tea brokers agreed to reduce their evaluative language to a finite number of terms. They came up with a revised glossary, which was forwarded then back to the ITA's Kolkata office for further refinement. in consultation with Toklai scientists, right? The point being that brokers, scientists, and planters were kind of triangulating what kind of constituted this standardized glossary. But then after that final revision, or that round of revision, the glossary went back to the Tea Brokers Association for final revisions, followed by final approval from the ITA's London-based Scientific Advisory Committee, which ironically contained no scientists, but they were the Scientific Advisory Committee. And so word by word, representatives from these three groups, from the plantation, from brokerage, and from the scientific sector, settled on terms for describing the qualities of dried leaves, steep leaves, and tea liquor, right? So these are the kind of the things that were evaluated. Dry leaf, steep leaf, tea liquor. For example, the term Besky refers to the taste of infused tea liquor. In his original glossary, Harler described Besky as a slightly high-fired tea. The 1934 revision by the ITA London Committee and the Brokers Association revised that definition to defective or faulty firing and sometimes slightly over-fired. Once the glossary was returned to scientists at Toklai, they amplified the definition further to add the phrase, certain instances of bakiness have been associated with bacterial infection. I know, again, delicious. So when Toklai's revisions were reviewed back in London by the Tea Brokers Association, they deleted that final sentence about bacterial infection. The final glossary, published in 1938, which is still pretty much what we see today, Besky is defined as follows. Faulty firing, not necessarily at too high a temperature, but often due to leaves being too long or too thickly spread in the dryer. Harler's efforts brought forth a debate about quality's definition and its boundaries. Take Besky. Toklai scientists wanted to link Besky, a Besky sensation, to bacteria. But brokers and planters consistently rejected such causal relationships or causal references, especially around bacterial infection, right? Because the idea being that you were always going to pour hot water over tea, so why bother with these kind of references to bacterial infection? Because the presumed bacteria would always be killed when hot water was applied to the tea. It is still kind of the case. But more importantly, right, while scientists wanted to kind of think about the specific kind of relationships about bacteria and really being specific about the field and factory processes, brokers and planters wanted to keep that a little bit more open. Because according to brokers and planters, in order to be effective tools for maximizing quality, Teawords needed to be standardized enough to be mutually intelligible, right? So that everyone knew it was what people were talking about. But they couldn't be so standardized that they began to become distinct categories of goods and bads. Every quality, I was constantly told, and what resonates in the 1930 materials as well, is that every quality has a market. To kind of link a sensation with something like bacterial infection, would to kind of move that into a kind of more normative assumption of association with bad, right, a bad quality, right? And that was what brokers and tea planters really fought through the kind of codification of this language. Okay. So together, the tea words in the glossary were tools for keeping quality subject to experimental rediscovery. The glossary of tea words allowed brokers to act as what historian of science Stephen Chapin calls virtual witnesses to the production process. But they also did the reverse, making plantation managers virtual witnesses to the processes by which brokers gave tea its monetary value. So in 1935, as the glossary revisions were kind of going on, the ITA appointed the Cambridge University biologist Frank Engeldow to form the first of two commissions of inquiry that he would eventually lead on the industry. The commission's purpose was to identify a way forward for the industry in the context of depression-induced crop restrictions, a looming world war, and a rising tide of anti-colonial sentiment. India would become independent by 1947, But even then, there was no clear sign that British capital would be expelled from the country. And in fact, it wasn't really until 1973 in the case of tea. So part of Engledow's mission then was to find a way to ensure the sustained dominance of British capital in the subcontinent after the formal end of empire. So in the picture here in the slide, it's a hand-drawn graph that I found in Engledow's notebooks, which shows the relative rates, sorry, it might not be totally visible here, but it shows the relative rates of consumption of tea, coffee, and cocoa in the United Kingdom. And you can kind of see towards the far side of the graph there, consumption falls around 1930 as the Great Depression sets in. Engledow was kind of charged with ensuring the continued market dominance of tea over these other stimulant products. And the Engledow Commission's initial survey, the pre-independence survey in the 1930s, entailed a lot of work with plantation owners and managers. And it revealed that what they termed the improvement of quality remained the ITA membership's highest priority. But Engledow, as a biologist, remained quite skeptical. After all, what counted as quality was still determined in large measure by a group of brokers whose practices remained largely illegible to science. Imperfect as it was, the new glossary had the potential to link British scientific practices, represented by Tokely, British aesthetic practices, represented by the tea brokers, and British productive practice, embodied in the tea plantation complex. And that was kind of the goal of this glossary. So to do this, the Engledow Commission proposed what he termed a new specification of quality, in which the professional broker would become a key member of the scientific staff. For the Commission, the objective of scientific investigation should be to connect cause and effect, right? That was the sole kind of purpose of scientific inquiry, to do that work of linking cause and effect. To understand the relationships between the sensory and material qualities of tea, as assessed by brokers, and notions of greater or lesser quality as reflected in market price. And Engledow believed that this could be done if brokers used not just a controlled lexicon, but only the 5 words you see here: color, strength, pungency, quality, and flavor. Again, this is kind of a snippet taken from his notebooks. With this super limited lexicon, the broker's body would become a kind of laboratory instrument. Its measurements would be calibrated to a known standard set by practitioners of the new science of industrial chemistry. The result was a multi-sided experimental system. These 5 words each correlated to the sensory experience of taste, look, and feel. Those experiences indirectly pointed to different aspects of plantation and factory production. But between the 1940s and the 1950s, chemists worked with a panel of these professional brokers to use these 5 terms in particular, and the strict set of criteria set out by Engledow. For example, tea's color would be judged as equal to, better than, or worse than a known standard, using the grading system you see here, again excerpted from Engledow's notebooks. Using brokers' evaluations, chemists strove to isolate chemical compounds, using such kind of compounds as polyphenols, teorubigins, and teoflavins, and to correlate their presence in tea to particular moments in the plantation production process. Engledow's thinly veiled goal was to make the monetary pricing of tea entirely subject to scientific scrutiny, to slowly eliminate any hint of aesthetic sensibility from the market. In fact, he ultimately wanted to eliminate brokers altogether. In the end, this mission failed. Engledow's 5 words never replaced the larger glossary, and science has not yet supplanted brokerage, so there's still kind of attempts to figure out ways to do so. But this work did cement the regimentation of laboratory practice in brokerage practice post-independence. So the brewing of tea in tasting rooms in Calcutta began to be synchronized by precise clocks, weights of tea and volumes of water, even the crockery out of which tasters slurped their tea were now all tightly regulated. One other thing that brokers' aesthetic craft and chemist scientific technique had in common was the conviction that some bodies were more suited than others by dint of race, gender, or class to act as experimental instruments. So as colonial rule came to an end, however, the Indian government began pushing for the inclusion of Indian men into the ranks of tea brokerage. In order to seize some measure of sovereignty over the country's most recognizable agricultural export, India needed a new class of male experts, brokers, plantation managers, and scientists, who could inhabit and navigate the infrastructures, both scientific and aesthetic, that had been created by British occupation. Though the habits, terms, and sartorial styles of Indian tea brokers today retain a distinct air of Britishness, contemporary tea brokerage is not simply a process of colonial mimicry. But what is kind of interesting thinking about the post-independence time period is that tea itself was never a question, right? It was always about how to work with this product. Tea, unthinking tea was not the question. Okay, so let's return then to the tasting room, to the where I started this talk. Every day, tasting room workers prepare those trays of teas for brokers to taste. One of these workers moves down the long line of tables, the long tables weighing out tea samples. He's remarkably accurate, needing to adjust the weight of tea by only a tiny pinch or so. After weighing, he dumps the tea into white ceramic mugs lined up down the tables. Then he puts the small sample bag behind the mug. A co-worker follows him, filling the mugs with hot water from a large electric kettle. A third follows behind, placing a lid on top of each mug with a clink. Their movements create a din of crunching leaves, clanging crockery, and crinkling plastic. The Albert Bishop regulator clocks tick in the background. After 5 minutes, the clock dings, and one of the workers moves back down the line, straining the liquid from each mug into a tea-stained cup by tipping it on its side and slowly twisting the lid, allowing the steeped liquor to pour out. Then he flips the mug upside down and taps it such that the wet tea leaves would kind of collect on the top of the lid. He presses or pinches the leaves so that they stay in place on the top of that lid. Finally, he places that upturned the lid, topped with this pyramid of aromatically freshly steeped tea leaves, onto the rim of the empty mug. The resulting trio, a cup of tea liquor, a pile of steeped leaves, and a container of dry leaf, sit together on the tray. At the end of this process, dozens and sometimes hundreds of invoices have been arranged on these wooden trays in kind of 13-cup sets. Throughout the day, workers in the tasting room repeat these actions, cup after cup, tray after tray, table after table. And steep after steep of black tea stains these white ceramic cups. One day, one of the office clerks caught me looking at one of the empty cups and unprompted said, quoting, "You may think it's dirty, but it's not. In a clean white cup, you don't taste the deepness." Tea does not taste the same in a squeaky clean cup. The patina left by previous cups serves as a kind of visual reminder of the past and future of these practices. For brokers, deepness is both spatial and temporal. Even with the regimentation and steady rhythms that govern the tasting room, tea also does not taste the same on Monday as it does on Friday. The invoices are, of course, changing throughout the week, but the water used to steep tea sits in storage tanks all weekend, which affects the taste of tea on Monday morning. Taste it later in the week, and the taste will be different. The first duty of the broker is to put the unruly variability, not just of regions, sizes, styles, and grades into a discernible order, but also to kind of envision things like the kind of milk or the qualities of water that tea will be steeped with. Each broker focuses on a particular category of tea, but regardless of the specialty, right, whether it's Darjeeling tea or Assam tea or a CTC, for example, right, which is just used for domestic consumption, regardless of the specialty of the broker, the tasting process is the same. And it's a legacy of the experimental system set up by Engeldow and the ITA scientists in the 1940s and 1950s. So Stephen Chapin, drawing on the work of the sociologist Antoine Hennion, notes that an outsized amount of theoretical attention has been paid to the social uses of taste, to things like taste as a social marker, to explanations of changing tastes, to fashion as a social phenomenon, right? Kind of in short, to taste as something that's kind of fully ideological. In this line of analysis, taste connotes both a sensory experience and a metaphorical referent for what Pierre Bourdieu terms distinction. Something can taste good and someone can have good taste. In that foundational study of taste, Bourdieu asked where seemingly natural embodied know-how about things like food or dress or art or music, where it comes from. For Bourdieu, how foods or drinks are supposed to taste are bound up with class-based norms about how someone is supposed to act, or how someone is supposed to dress. But thanks to colonially and economically embedded ideas about how people are supposed to behave and how things are supposed to taste, a broker's abilities and the tea before him come to appear natural. The training of brokers in Kolkata includes how to taste a cup of tea, taking into account weight, cuppage, timing, and water temperature. But it also includes orientation to the dynamics of geography, seasonal variations, factory finishing, and shipping processes. This knowledge is hard to transmit. For this reason, according to all the brokers that I work with, the right kind of person, right, in those exact terms, right, the right kind of person has to be invited to train as an apprentice. Normative assumptions about masculinity and class are immaterial legacies, somatic and linguistic remains of the Bengali elites, entanglement with British economic and political elites in the commercial spaces of old Kolkata. Bourdieu's ideas suggest a plausible connection between quality and markets. But I want to kind of propose a slightly different answer to the question of why things like tea come to appear naturally possessed of qualities such as taste and value, and as well as why certain individuals come to appear naturally endowed with the ability to identify, to kind of suss out those qualities. So as Chapin argues, to understand tasting as a technique, right, and Chapin's writing about wine tasting here, but in order to understanding tasting broadly as a technique, rather than just an expression of distinction, it is necessary to attend to tasters' efforts to arrange a stronger presence of the tasted object, to attend to and respond to what the tasted object reveals, to what it is saying. Taste and language are thus fused, but in a somewhat different way. Tea has something to say about the conditions of its own production. The circulation of tea words within the closed communicative circuit between tea brokerage houses, tea plantations, and tea research stations maintains the unequal material social conditions of the plantation. The result is not the rendering of taste into the numerical register of price. It's not only the rendering of the taste into this numerical register of price, but also the recapitulation and reinforcement of colonially derived forms of bodily discipline. The training of bodies, of brokers, and of distant field and factory laborers To respond to tea's material qualities is, in a coherent, if differentiated way, is a prerequisite to setting prices, to making sales, and even to marketing the beverage to consumers. Another peek at the tasting process might reinforce this point a bit. One day I followed Mr. Dutta and one of his apprentices through the tasting process. Mr. Dutta began with a set of teas graded as Tippy Golden Flowery Orange Pico, or what are just kind of known as TGFOPs. He's right, so tea grading is kind of fun, right? The highest grade for Indian tea is Superfine Tippy Golden Flowery Orange Pico. You lose a letter every step to down to Orange Pico as the lowest grade. So it's a very regimented system. Anyway, so these are TGFOPs. So he tasted a tea and he slurped and he said, contains broken as well as flaky leaf. He slurped the next invoice, mushy. Fanning's neat, suitable. On the next invoice, he slurped and said, colonials have good show of tip, good flavor, brightness. And the next, colonial samples have hardly any tip. Fanning's acceptable. Early invoices have some brightness, character. But teas from 18 onwards show a decline, 350. When Mr. Dutta says 350, he's naming the prospective price in rupees per kilogram for that particular invoice, that he is promising that his firm will pay the plantation, 50% of that price before the auction. After auction, his firm will pay the difference between that initial payment, in this case 175 rupees per kilogram, and the actual final auction price, the sale price of the tea. So in a very real way, the brokerage finances the plantation industry by this kind of 50% project. So Mr. Dutta moved on to a new trade and a different kind of a different plantation's teas altogether. He slipped a few invoices and then declared, leaf grades need more style. Slight improvement on later dates, but teas need to be more even. He moved on to another. On the blackish side, short in appearance and flaky leaf. Not free from stalk. Touch of briskness, but character needs to be more prominent. Teas are a little plain, 280. As he tasted, Mr. Dutta set out a few examples of what are termed standards. Using his palate as an instrument, Mr. Dutta was able to select certain exemplary teas from those on offer against which he could measure others, also up on the trays. The standard selection, too, reflected the experimental model that originated with the work of colonial chemists. And Engeldow would at least be, pleased with this, right? That there's some idea of what a standard is. But because of tea's complexity and variability, it was impossible for Mr. Dutta to know in advance what might count as a standard on a particular day, or in this particular season. Experiences of trial and surprise are essential to the production of quality tea, because teas often do not taste, look, or feel the way that brokers think that they should. Mr. Dutta needed to impart to his apprentice the importance of thinking experimentally. The apprentice nodded. Then Mr. Dutta directed his quality comments to the clerk who follows him along kind of with this easel on wheels, making notes as they moved and as they tasted. Quoting again, grades become smaller, uneven. They need to possess more style. Liquors of 98 and 99 have a little brightness and character, but the remaining cups are a little coloring. Mr. Dutta used Teawords not just to train his apprentice, but also to convey to faraway plantation managers to think experimentally too. Quality comments rendered in these finite Teawords have direct implications for the management of laboring bodies, almost all women, who pluck, prune, and process tea leaves on plantations. Tasting, then, is a process by which metropolitan male experts evaluate tea harvested by ethnically marked women in fields on the edges of India, from Assam to Kerala. On tea plantations, women workers manually comb tea bushes for tender shoots of tea, breaking them off between their thumb and index fingers and tossing fistfuls into conical baskets strewn from their heads. Indian labor law mandates that workers be issued plastic aprons and rubber boots to protect them from the sharp protruding branches of the tea bushes, as well as from leeches and snake bites. In the off-season, women flog these same bushes with small sickles to ensure that tender shoots return with the next rains. Blistered, cut, and blackened by dirt, sap, and chlorophyll, women tea workers' bodies are monitored and protected by national labor codes as well as international trade standards. Women on India's numerous organic certified tea plantations, for example, are prohibited from wearing gloves. Regulators fear that cotton or other fabric might adulterate the taste of tea. Indeed, it is this image of women's bare fingers pinching 2 leaves and a bud that often accompanies tea advertisements and adorns tea packaging. Value in the consumer market is attached to a symbolic association between women and tea, but the tasting process reveals that this association is more than symbolic. In its taste, smell, and appearance, tea contains messages, rendered in those tea words, about the material conditions of field labor. When brokers relay those messages back to plantation management, everything from work hours to wages to protective equipment are all up for experimental recalibration. Through the tasting process and the deployment and circulation of tea words, the noses and tongues of male brokers are thus materially and semiotically linked to the hands of women tea workers in plantation fields. So since the colonial era, the job of tea planters in India has been to maximize quality under algorithms designed to control the costs of production. The quality comments from brokers, from tasters in places like Nilhat House are intended to help optimize the relationship between raw material, machinery, and labor. In their calculations of the cost of production, the monetary return on each invoice of tea, planters must consider the comments of brokers in Kolkata alongside with an array of other technical questions. From the proportion of burned coal to made tea, to the cost of rubber boots, to the price of rice and flour rations, and to the upkeep of nurseries and primary schooling for the children of workers who live on the plantations. Through tea words, the spatialities and temporalities of the field, factory, and tasting room become entangled. As Karen Barad argues, following Leila Fernandez, gender and ethnicity are not merely cultural add-ons to economic structures. They are co-constituted by political economic systems and the hardware and software of the industry, from those rubber boots to the sickles to coal-fired machinery to tasting procedures and things like glossaries. Captured in tea works, the embodied work of plantation laborers and tea brokers reverberate through tea itself. So for some just concluding thoughts. While quality in capitalist markets, and kind of often in food studies more generally, is frequently posited as an end to itself, I would like to offer a different interpretation. Quality is not an endpoint. It is not a more or less than proposition. It is a material and semiotic variable, one that can be viewed and manipulated in a variety of sites. Quality is not just a slippery concept because it is inevitably subjective. It is a slippery concept because it is shaped by changing material relationships. Stabilizing quality, then, requires not only disciplining feelings, but also disciplining soils, machinery, and bodies. Language is essential to that discipline. Lexical registers imbue the slippery notion of quality with the capacity to travel from spaces of production to spaces of consumption. So what my work kind of brings to a kind of a study of the anthropology of food is a historical view of value that attends to the ways that gendered and racialized logics are materially and semiotically transposed onto food itself. Attention to the colonial and post-colonial blending of science, connoisseurship, and management shows how the travels of quality through the intermediate spaces between production and consumption are crucial to the operation of capitalist markets. The quality that emerges in the experimental interplay between tea words, chemicals, managerial styles, suits and ties, and even tea itself can be informative for how anthropologists frame industrial capitalist projects. Anthropologists of food often use the terms commodity chain or supply chain to describe those projects. Drawn from the lexicon of organizational sociology, these terms evoke a thinkable, workable economic space. So even though the chain is metaphorical in business, in anthropology it's been effective at drawing attention to the hidden material ways in which the social lives of people and things are connected. But if, kind of as I've suggested, quality is constantly produced experimentally in non-linear arrangements between bodies and materials, then it may be necessary to think beyond metaphorical chains to what Michelle Murphy calls pattern conjunctures, the spatial arrangements of relationships that draw humans, things, words, and non-humans together in commodity circulation. The quality of tea, or food, or water, or pharmaceuticals, or any number of other things is shaped by the materials and the means by which it moves around the world. Yet an attention to history shows how unstable, perishable, and reactive these materials and means often are. So plantations might seem as relics of a colonial era and colonial production. They are spatial arrangements that must be continually, experimentally re-articulated. Perceptibility, Murphy argues, is made in regimes, right, which he terms regimes. Disciplinary forms of knowledge that allow for things to be thinkable. Brokerage, and the glossary in particular, is one such regime. Brokerage is a means by which the plantation continues to be thinkable and knowable. The plantation remains the answer to the question of how quality tea is produced. Quality is thus a discourse through which inequality persists. Thank you. I can go now.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Victor.
Okay. I have two linked questions. One a historical question and one linguistic, and they're closely intertwined.
Okay.
First, I asked, did you ever come across a gentleman named Roger Pearson? Do you know the name? He was the last administrator of a British Tea Marketers Association.
Okay.
And I know him very well. And he was very, he was sad because he worked for the British tea marketers and brokers for decades, and he had to give it over to the Indians. So that's the historical thing, whether you knew him or whether you might want to know him, because I can introduce him.
Okay, fabulous.
The other thing is that this glossary, this terminology, developed over decades, maybe 5 decades, entirely within an Anglophone environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So now, after the early 70s, it becomes Indians who are doing this work, and we saw from their photographs that they're using these terms. And I'm two questions. One is, are they speaking entirely in English? Okay, so the language of the brokerage is still English, entirely. Now, then the next question, is it conceivable that these very complex terms and these very precise terms can be transferred into Bengali or Hindi or some Indian language? Or do you just borrow them in? Are they translatable?
I mean that's a great question. I mean, all I can say is they're not, right? In terms of the terms of art through which tea is valued. I would maybe by way of kind of talking around this, right? Apprentices, and even within the space of the auction, so after tea is tasted, it goes in its auction. People are reprimanded and disciplined for not speaking in English. Right, so the medium of the sale of tea in the space of the auction is regimented as English, right? All of the evaluative paperwork that is transmitted back from brokerage to the plantations is 100% in English. Even when brokers, so once a season, brokers go to the plantations and do kind of a mock tasting in which their expertise is kind of reaffirmed for the brokers in live settings. they too discipline planters, right? Who plantation managers, right? Who are not the ones that are often in these spaces of in Calcutta, right? In no-houses for using non-English terms, right? So, for example, I have another kind of snippet where there's a tea manager who's tasting a tea, and he's like, oh, this tastes like a doopie tree. Doopie are these kind of the Cryptomeria japonica, these evergreen trees that grow in Darjeeling. It tastes like a doopie, and he's like, and the broker's like, no, like that is not. No, he's just like, it's green, right? So there's kind of this very deliberate disciplining. So yes, hypothetically, there's translatability, but they are not. That is not how it works.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was really amazing. So my question is about your attention to the body, because on the one hand, the way the tea tasting works is this increased sensitivity to like the water that's being used, the teacups, a kind of expanded field of awareness. But then at the same time, the science or the connoisseurship seems to reduce people to mouths, eyes, noses. So how is this science and technique working to expand and reduce body?
That's a great. That's the question, right? That's wonderfully well put. That's what I'm kind of attending to, right? Is that there's this really rigid regimentation of how brokers can act within the space of tasting, but where the kind of openness is, or maybe it's differently rigid, is in that recruitment practice. So for me, it's about attending to both of these spaces. So the means by which apprentice brokers can come into the system is non-scientific in that the brokerage houses go into elite schools, mostly in Calcutta, and they have what are called group discussions, which are like group interviews. Like 12 of us sit around a table, and after the interviewees are asked questions that have nothing to do with tea. So tell me, what was the last time or tell me where there's a will, there's a way means to you. That's an interview question. Nothing, right? Nothing where any understanding of tea, commodity circulation, anything where that would be of value, right? So, and in kind of asking questions about what makes a good broker? What are you looking for when you're hiring these apprentices? Attention to they should be really good at team sports. Why? It's this ability to be able to work with others and think reactively. And then they would also just and they shouldn't be book smart, because that would be another detriment. So I don't know if I'm quite answer your question, but there's a way in which what kind of makes a valid or a legible body is not just in that scientific space. It's thinking about kind of the open or the different kind of places in which ideas about rightness and normativity kind of are articulated throughout the kind of tasting process. First, who gets to come to the door, and then how do they act once they're in the door? Right? Because really explicitly, these are people who cannot be trained outside of the door. Right? There are tea tasting courses that you can pay for, tea management courses as well, but tea tasting in particular, no one gets a job. No one who kind of comes through those schools ever gets a job in that brokerage houses. In fact, those schools are quite derided. It's that interplay between bodies, materials, and markets that I'm kind of interested in kind of how commodities kind of can continue to circulate. Oh wow, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the shaping of the imagined tea drinker, and how that process is embodied by the tasters and the brokers. Is there a disciplining there?
Yeah.
So just how is that imagined drinker sort of performed and embodied in the brokers?
I think what's most significant for the brokers is knowing full well that except for a very small fraction of cases, tea will never be drunk alone. Tea is always going to be blended, and so brokers are thinking about it as these disaggregatable qualities that can that can be meshed with other qualities, right? And so the intended consumer is not this coherent thing that's going to drink this exact tea. In fact, most tea that comes to the auction will never be drunk alone, ever. And so it's like its ability to store well, its ability to look nice as a dried tea, even though if it could taste terrible or it could taste like nothing at all, which would be more the case. If it looks nice, then we can kind of think about its market, its sale price based on that, the attractiveness of its dried leaf. And so what's maybe interesting as an answer to your question is that figure is not what they care about. It's the blend, its ability to blend and what qualities they can focus on to blend, right? Again, it's steep liquor, dry leaves, and wet leaves, right? The wet leaves for some markets, namely places like India, is very, very important. The way the steep leaves look is more important than the intended consumer. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, great talk, thank you. I have two questions that turn on this quality term that you identified over the past, it's been going on now for some 2 decades. Throughout the talk, you discussed this distinction between quality, so capital Q quality, versus the qualities over which quality has scope. So could you tease out this distinction for us? Is quality sort of a meta-quality, which they stipulate over some unstated but semiotically salient ensemble of qualities?
Totally.
Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah.
And the second has to do with moving beyond tea room talk and some of the qualia literature, right? Which I see you gesturing toward. For the past 5 years or so, there's been this line of flight in linguistic anthropology out of that domain, realizing that qualities as adjectives, which is essentially how they're being treated with literature, right? They assert nothing. They need to exist within some configurational structure, right? So featuring pre-modification by intensifiers, right? Very shocking, for instance. Have you thought about how these issues of intensification or comparison or superlative constructions like this within the tea room might sort of flesh this out a bit more? And related to the earlier question, it's not just brokers per se who grade qualities, right? Folks out there grade them, saying this is a better tea than that one, which is then causally linked to where they go to buy certain teas. So all of this sort of relates to that opening statement about the quality term, and I was wondering if you could flesh this out a little bit.
Yeah. So kind of taking the second part first, relating back to the last question on that intended consumer, right? The linguistic frame through which tea is thought and understood as good, bad, or indifferent is so kind of framed through through the quality turn a la food studies, right? Like bourgeois, Western, consumerist kind of notions about tea, about coffee and wine, honestly, right? So the linguistic reference and kind of even how I see tea described on boxes, the words are tea words never come in, right? It's pretty much the borrowing of mostly wine frameworks to understand, to kind of to make tea make sense, and as a fancy product, right? As something that is distinguished or distinguishable. So that to me is what's interesting about how tea is maybe so different or potentially quite different than coffee and wine, is that there's these neither the twain shall meet kind of linguistic registers going on to me. But in terms of the qualia discussion, it's been so thought-provoking and generative for me to kind of think more with linguistic anthropology, which is wasn't something I was doing before I kind of started this project. And for me to kind of think about, as you kind of started with, how is quality that more or less than proposition? Because oftentimes in our kind of maybe our own vernacular, everyday life, quality is something that there's more of or there's less of, right? Quality is a weirdly quantitative relationship. But in terms of how it was used, right? And I kind of started seeing this in looking at the historical material around the industry, how quality as a broader idea that wasn't necessarily more or less than informed for form in the industry was what kind of made me glom onto quality. So why quality? It was that it did this work particularly for people within the industry that wasn't how I generally kind of thought about it, as this quantity is qualitative, or quality is quantitative, excuse me. And that's kind of what interests me about the use of T-words is they're often, I mean, I can kind of go way back to this descriptive sheet. This is like, this is how T is evaluated. It's not superlative. So maybe in some of the quality comments that he's, kind of literally often barking out to the guy pushing the easel, they may be qualified, but this is how plantations get their markers as the word, the singular word that's supposed to do that kind of work. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah. There's lots of hands. Yeah. I know there was someone in the back, and yeah. Do you have a two-finger on that? Okay. Okay, go for it.
Okay. I just really super quick, because I'm curious about the point Andrew's making in terms of maybe the historical slides that you showed us before, where you saw like the definitions of the word sort of being negotiated over, these decades. Because you often saw like some of these modifiers coming in those discussions, like over-baked, especially when it came to how it related to the physical. So I'm curious about how maybe not in the final product of description, but in the commensuration of people's own perception of these, like what these adjectives then are related to, if that's where some of the quantity comes into the quality.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so there has been practices where like two brokers taste the same teas and try to work out valuation to get to actually make bakiness commensurable, and like how and like whether or not so the way that those words are often made commensurable is literally two people tasting the same tea and kind of working on this together. That's done in some of the large brokerage houses. If that kind of gets at some of your question, but like what's embedded in the words, I think is important, right? That it's that overness or not enoughness is supposed to be indexed in the singularity of the word, right? To overfired, underfired. So sorry, yeah, in the back, yeah.
Thanks very much. I thought maybe a lot of what you're talking about could be translated to thinking about academic quality. So my question links sort of to the first comment about languages other than English. I'm wondering, do you have a sense of how what you're talking about here for the British Empire, how it might also work or work differently for other colonial pattern conjunctions of tea production, specifically Dutch, Asian, European? Did they work with English language? Did they have similar tea words? Or did they actually have different, less maybe word-based and more numerical ways of translating?
That's super interesting. So the Dutch, what the whole kind of like British Dutch like interdigitation in the industry is really interesting, and like there should be a whole lot more work done on that. How I've looked at it mostly is the quality turn that happens in the 1930s is really influenced by the fact that Dutch production is dumping tons and tons and tons of tea on the market, and they're not again, I'm reading this firmly from the British perspective and having not done any of the work that needs to get done, right, is that Dutch tea is unqualified, right? It's okay, like, full disclosure, like, I'm reading this from an uber British lens, like, I have zero clue what I'm talking about. But I mean, the way that, like, the Dutch tea comes in as a spoil to, like, what we can't and shouldn't be, like, quality is the way to differentiate ourselves from the Dutch market. But then the Dutch market collapses, and then and then right with the Japanese occupation of Java, right, all of the crop restrictions that were so firmly put in place for upon occasion, right, they were strengthened and released from the 1920s into the 1930s, you didn't have to worry about them anymore. But then also during the wartime, the attention to quality kind of wanes a little bit at the same time that the Dutch market is suffering because the Ministry of Food is mass buying all tea produced in the British Empire, and they're like, don't tell us these words, like, we actually don't care, like, just like, we need to buy it and we need to ration it in the UK. So your question is fabulous and fantastic, and I would love to know more about especially the Dutch stuff. But what's interesting to me is that in the spaces of Colombo, in the spaces of Mombasa, this stuff traveled, and yes, I'm talking about kind of regimentation of this in Calcutta and across Calcutta and London, but Calcutta and London were the major nodes in the British tea system, and whatever kind of happened in these two spaces was then kind of translated to East Africa and Sri Lanka, or Ceylon at the time. And so the bodily decorum, right, the regimentation of, like the scientific type regimentation of tasting and evaluative practice looks really similar in East Africa and Sri Lanka even today.
But did it seep outside of the Anglophone, that English, the British?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, like, and the brokers that I work with today are very quick to say that this stayed very bounded. And then, like, the bounds of how quality was talked about had pretty strong walls around it. Yeah. And to the point where, like, major tea buyers that I work with have zero idea about how this language works. Yeah.
So my question builds on this vocabulary, the nomenclature, and even on your wine analogies and coffee analogy. And so I wonder, firstly, is just like there is a wine terroir for the soils, the quality of the impact of soil and climate on the production of different wines, is there something that is mapped the same way the tea growing region that ultimately have some effect on the way in which these terms are derived from the teas that they're being tasted? And then the second question has there been any attempt for this translation issue for the buyers and so on to go from this sort of hyper-technical and very historically contextualized and situated language to one which actually does shift it into more of a line nomenclature? Like, what does it mean fairly bright? What does this mean in terms of a Pinot or something having sort of more of a berry flavor as opposed to something that has less tannic qualities and so forth, which are descriptive and you can actually taste them. How does the translation work here to the actual palate for those who want to actually consume teas and who are particular about what they want to taste?
Yes, like the Indian government, the Tea Board of India, which is the kind of government regulator of the tea industry, put a lot of money into sending kind of the most famous, most like dynamic, charismatic broker on the road to Australia in particular and to the UK to kind of try to translate. And Australia was targeted first, and the most money was put there because there's this wine drinking culture in Australia to kind of take, or in wine producing culture, to take the frameworks with which people kind of talk in their everyday lives about wine and wine value to kind of make tea make sense. And it's largely kind of thought of by the brokers who got kind of rolled out to do this work as a kind of largely failed project because there's the way that the brokers talk about it is that there's history comes to repeat itself. There's zero regimentation. There's no standardization with how consumers and how retailers are describing wine words. I mean, it's just whatever kind of makes sense in terms of like a way to kind of sell your tea. Again, this is the broker's kind of description of how tea retailers do their work. It's just like, we think that tea consumers kind of like the idea of citrusy tea, or like they like berries and they like this, and they're just gonna like put that on their tea marketing. So there was an attempt to try to make tea make sense a little bit more in the context of wine, such that to take some of these tea words, the ones that are especially the ones that are more logical, like something like bakey, which is like, it's a high fire, right? Bake, over baked, okay, got that one, right? Like, to make that.
What is the taste associated with that?
But what is the taste associated with? But like a lot of, but I think they're like focused on the fact that these words are intertrade, is that like, does the consumer actually care if this is overfired? And what's interesting is that, again, going back to the question about blending, is that all of the qualities with which blenders think about their tea are often blended out into these like branded tastes. So like PG Tips taste like something. Lipton tastes like something, and it has to taste like that same something each and every time, lets the consumer think that it is off.
That's also true with coffee, with the way
Yeah,
you
with
do
blended
coffees,
coffee.
and also with what you do with wines.
Right.
It's not different in that respect.
No, it's not. And then, but that's the work. That's more of like where brokers have. The brokers are not working with blenders in that way. Like the Teawords project was to put them out into the consumer spaces to make like tea seem less mystifying.
So then,
But it's still pretty mystifying.
So with regard to where the teas come, and the soils and all that,
Yeah.
the task of making a reproducible taste out of blends of teas that vary from month to month or over some period of time
Day to day.
seems to be an extraordinarily difficult thing to regulate and keep track of. So how do they make decisions about what gets blended or not? Is it actually literally rooted in the ground where the places that they're grown, or are they just taking whatever comes their way, and then the key to making tea is in-house? It doesn't really matter where it's from. It's what comes, and then you put it together.
It really doesn't matter, and that is like blending companies, like Tata, for example, right? That makes several different blends of tea, or not several, many different blends of tea. They have in-house tasters that do their work is quite experimental, and the way that it was quite always stressed to me the way that that blenders taste their tea, they're so much more detail oriented, right? Because it's about thinking about those things in combination, right? And the blenders are the ones that are working out those blends, and so absolutely. But the way that blends can persist as a kind of somewhat familiar taste is that you have to be buying tea from the Mombasa auction and the Colombo auction, and especially if you're Tata or you're one of these mega companies, right? If you're Hindustan Unilever or Unilever in general or Tata, you are buying from all three of those auctions as well as from plantations directly, and you're working across that crazy variability but not just the way it tastes, it's the way it costs. So on top of all of it, you have to think about the blend at a cost point. Because it can't go over that because that would just be stupid. Right? Under, great. Over, no. But then the terroir stuff, but more, it's not like it is in wine. In fact, tea is much more like the ideas and the logics and the linguistic kind of descriptions about terroir are very much kind of invented to make sense again in the line.
We could do one more if there's one more question. Otherwise, we'll just say thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful.